providing assistance at the request of the Iraqi government to defeat Daesh. Australia is there, alongside the United States, indeed second only to the United States for the size of our contribution, because we have concluded that it is not only in our national interest to prevent Australian citizens from joining terrorist organisations that are seeking to undermine and overthrow the state system, about 180 Australians known to us at the present time, but it is also in the broader global interest for us to contribute to a coalition response. Yes, we face considerable challenges to the sovereignty of the nation-state, yet we are not daunted. We will not be intimidated. We can be confident that as countries like Australia and the United States and other international partners are prepared to step up to these challenges, together we will prevail and prosper. Moreover, we can be confident that the nation-state will endure as the main institution through which we pursue the prosperity of our people and defend and promote our values and our way of life. Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions. We have time for a couple of questions before the Minister has to leave. Just wait to get mic'd up. And if I could just take a moment, when the Minister has to leave, if you could please stay in your seats as the Minister leaves and waiting for Christine Wormuth to arrive.
I should point out that I'm not leaving for any purpose other than to meet with Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Kerry, National Security Advisor Rice, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee Senator Bob Hawker. So I'm
Delight after.
I'm not wanting you to feel unloved, that's all.
We'll go straight to questions. Gentleman in the front.
Thanks so much, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Minister, thanks for a terrific speech and kind of scary, actually, which I hope is part of your intent, to get people's attention, to make us focus on, my God, what are we going to do? A bigger question and then a more focused question. I get the sense in listening to you that it worries you that while there are many multilateral approaches and responses to all these various challenges you laid out, that perhaps by definition there's a lack of coordination, and we're all sort of scattered around. And am I right in thinking that? And do you have a sense that maybe it's time to be talking about a world NATO against terrorism or something, or is that too big a chunk to bite off? I think that was implied in what you're asking. And then a more specific on the U.S., Japan, Australia alliance, which would fit into that rubric of working together on issues. How do you see the cooperation there working with our friends in China to lower tensions in maritime, not just in the South China Sea, but also in the Senkakus? So thank you so much for a very tough speech.
Thank you very much. There are a number of issues there. I also used our time on the Security Council to chair meetings on counter-terrorism and this issue of foreign fighters. And I do point out that Australia has about 180 known citizens who are either fighting with ISIL in Iraq and Syria or are supporting them from Australia. That's known to us. I gather it's a similar number to the United States, and so given the per capita assessment, we clearly have more than our fair share of foreign fighters. So I used the opportunity in the Security Council to also call for a special envoy from the UN for this specific issue of countering violent extremism and countering this phenomena of foreign terrorist fighters. Yes, I am deeply troubled by this phenomenon, and I guess spending yesterday with the heads of your security and intelligence agencies only added to my concern. Again, I see the United States as taking a lead role because of its indispensable position of the world superpower, but the point I'm making is that every one of us, and there are 80 countries around the world who self-nominate as having foreign fighters in their midst. There are 80 countries who acknowledge that they have people leaving their countries to fight under some toxic Islamist ideology in the Middle East. So I believe that there has to be a significant coalition, again, as always, led by the United States, but with countries being prepared to step up and take their fair share of the burden to stem this terrifying challenge that we as nation states currently face. And I do believe that much has been achieved through the Security Council, but much more can be done. I note that China and Russia also nominate a number of citizens as terrorists who have joined the fight in the Middle East. So we're all in this together, and that has to be acknowledged. The second part of your question in relation to the Australia, Japan, United States trilateral partnership is a very strong one. It's something that we certainly support. Our leaders have met at the G20. I've met with the foreign ministers, the Secretary of State of both the US and Japan to discuss matters of common and mutual interest, and it's a grouping, a trilateral grouping that I think has a great deal to offer the region in particular. Of course, the United States rebalance or pivot, however one likes to call it, is deeply appreciated in our region in whatever form it takes, whether it be militarily or whether it be through the trade efforts through the TPP. And Australia and Japan are, I think, fundamental to the support the United States is receiving for its rebalance to the Asia Pacific. As far as China is concerned, we work very hard to ensure that our relationship with China is a strong and positive one. We encourage China to be part of the rules-based international system, whether it's in responding to military threats, whether it's responding to the challenges of setting up a new set of rules to apply to trading relationships. We want China to be part of this, and I think during the G20 we certainly saw a more positive approach by China to some of the entreaties from the US, Australia, and of course there was the rather historic meeting between the leaders of China and Japan in recent times. I was speaking with the Foreign Minister of Japan just prior to that actual meeting in Myanmar, and there was a great deal of anticipation but also trepidation as to what would occur. But I think it is a good sign that we can make progress in lessening the tensions that arise from the Senkaku Diaoyu territorial claims and also applying to the South China Sea. But Australia, Japan, the United States have a significant role to play in ensuring that China likewise sees negotiation and peaceful means as the only way to settle those territorial disputes. It will take time, but patience is always a good virtue to have in these circumstances.
Front.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I have one more terrorism question, if you can stand one more. In the wake of the events in Paris and what's going on in Iraq and Syria, clearly Europe is going through a sea change in how they're perceiving the threat of terrorism and how and the tools they're developing for dealing with it. Do you see what's going on in Europe as having important lessons for the Asia Pacific? Do you see the threat level in the Asia Pacific and in Australia as on the increase in the wake of Paris? Do you think that we need some heightened vigilance, some changes in how we deal with the issue in the Asia Pacific region, or do you think this is primarily something in other parts of the world?
Most certainly the events in Paris have focused the minds of a number of European nations as to what reforms they need to implement in order to give their authorities the capacity to better deal with these challenges. I remember 12 months ago when I was here in the US, there was a raging debate in the wake of the Snowden affair as to privacy versus security, and at that point I would suggest that privacy considerations were winning the debate. I'm interested to detect a far different approach 12 months down the track. Of course, you have some legislative issues coming up before the Congress in the next few months, and perhaps that will determine once and for all whether my inkling is right. But nevertheless, in Australia, most certainly, we've made some significant reforms to our counter-terrorism laws, our foreign fighters bills. I now have the capacity to declare off-limits particular geographic locations for Australian citizens. The Al-Raqqa province, for example, which is now the headquarters of ISIL, is off-limits to Australian citizens unless you can come up with a very good reason for being there, a journalist, humanitarian worker, family. Otherwise, what's an Australian doing heading over to Al-Raqqa province? A cycling tour? Seriously. So we now have some significant powers to do what we can to restrain and disrupt the activities of Australian citizens who are attracted to this murderous ideology that they misguidedly see as some kind of noble cause, which it is not. There is a significant concern in Southeast Asia. It's shared by the countries including Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, of the number of foreign terrorist fighters in their countries. We know that there are a number of convicted terrorists who are likely to be released from jail in countries in our region in coming years. If one assumes that counter-radicalisation and rehabilitation programs have not had the impact that they should, that poses another level of threat. What I have seen, though, is an extraordinary level of cooperation, information sharing and sharing of experiences and lessons learned across the globe. Our relationship with the United States security and intelligence agencies could not be closer. The level of engagement is, I would suggest, unprecedented, perhaps Great Britain as well, but it's unprecedented. And we have a lot to offer each other. But we're also reaching out to countries with whom we might not have even contemplated sharing intelligence at present, and our agencies are as active as yours are in building networks of countries and nations who are being impacted by this terrorist scourge. And countries in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, North Asia, we are sharing information in unprecedented ways. And I believe that that will go some way to countering this threat.
You're going to have to leave in 1 minute, but before you do, let me ask you and give you.
Oh, you get the last question, do you?
I'm going to steal the last question. Your predecessor was noted for, before he took the job, he said that Australia's top foreign policy objective was to avoid a hard choice between the U.S. security relationship and the Chinese economic relationship. Do you see it as a tension? You have to manage both of these extraordinarily important relationships. How do you view that challenge?
I wouldn't put it in those terms at all, but I suggest that Australia is capable of maintaining more than one relationship. And it's not a question of an economic relationship with one country therefore precludes you from having a security relationship with another. It's a much more sophisticated and mature debate these days. And I believe that as our relationship with China broadens beyond an economic relationship, as the relationship between China and the United States broadens beyond a jostling for influence in the region, that we will see that kind of mature outcome that I've always expected would be the case, that there is far too much at stake for countries like the US and China, Australia and Japan to be fighting with each other. We have greater challenges and greater threats that we all face, which was the point I was seeking to make, that we all face as nation states determined to ensure the peace and prosperity for our citizens, that we must face together. And I think the issue of terrorism has brought these nations together in ways that could have been unimaginable even just a few years ago.
Thank you very much for doing this. Good luck in the rest of your program.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the Minister. And please keep your seats. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of your trip. We'll have Christine Wormuth to speak to us. Welcome back after lunch. I hope you had a good break. We're going to get going. We have a tight schedule. The Minister has to leave sharply on time. Before I introduce the Minister, I'll ask you, people are taking their seats, so I want to take a moment to give my thanks and that of Martin Indyk to Ambassador Kim Beazley, not just for his support of this event and his support of Brookings in general, hosted a wonderful program leadership committee dinner for us late last year, but also for his tireless efforts in support of the U.S.-Australia relationship. Kim has become a fixture on the D.C. scene, and the U.S. and Australia are both better off for it. So, Kim, thank you very much. Let me now welcome Julie Bishop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to Brookings, and it's a particular honor to do so. You all know very well that the Minister has played a wide range of roles in Australian government and opposition before assuming the mantle of Foreign Minister in September 2013. I think it is fair to say that it's been a turbulent year during a tenure which has lasted so far a little less than a year and a half. The Minister has had to handle Australia's elected seat on the UN Security Council and the G20, and all, of course, at a moment of turmoil in the Middle East, where, once again, Australia has partnered with the United States in dealing with one aspect of that crisis in particular. And I think it's worth highlighting the role that the Minister played in negotiations with the Iraqi government in terms of an agreement to allow the deployment of special forces to combat ISIS. The United States has a lot of allies, but there are fair weather friends and there are foul weather friends, and the difference is well noted and much appreciated in this city. All, of course, during the same period of time in which we've been grappling with an intensification of geopolitical rivalry, most importantly with Russia's actions in the Ukraine. And the Minister drew a lot of attention for the way she handled Mr. Putin at the UN, in the G20, and in particular in the aftermath of the downing of MH17, a role that I think showed not just considerable diplomatic nous, but just frankly plain guts. And while the issues may be more controversial in the bilateral relationship, given Obama's remarks at Brisbane, I wanted to highlight your leadership role on climate issues, including at the Peru summit. The Minister has also been very active and energetic on social media among her peers. She's very engaged on Twitter. I hope you found your earrings. No. Those of you who are under 40 got that joke. The rest of you didn't. Bless you. It goes without saying that Australia is one of America's most reliable allies with a long history of cooperation from World War II to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. And as we heard this morning from Andrew Scheer and Evan Medeiros, a relationship that's been retooled to be central to the management of the contemporary international order and the challenges that we face, from cyber terrorism to accommodating and dealing with the growth of China and many facets beyond. So I am delighted to welcome Minister Bishop to Brookings to talk about these and any other issues. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Good afternoon to friends of Australia, friends of the United States, and thank you to Brookings for the opportunity. The alliance between the United States and Australia is a central pillar of Australia's foreign policy and national security. Today, I will speak on a broader theme, but of relevance to this alliance of two open, liberal Western democracies. I'll address the importance of the nation-state itself and some of the contemporary challenges. For while there have long been predictions of the demise of the nation-state, there are new and even more dangerous threats to its continued existence and survival. Indeed, in my first speech in the Australian Parliament in 1998, I spoke about the pressures I then saw facing the state, largely brought about by globalisation, the revolutionary social change sparked by the digital revolution, and this was pre-Wi-Fi and iPhones, the rapid expansion in unrecorded intra-firm trade across national borders, making it harder than ever for states to regulate and tax corporate activity, the shrinking significance of geography and increasingly porous borders for goods, capital and labour. It was my view then that the challenge for the nation-state was to adapt, to harness the great possibilities and promises of globalisation. But today, pernicious forces have come to the fore and wield greater power than ever that threaten to undermine the nation-state. To globalisation's opportunities, we must now add transnational threats. Foreign terrorist fighters claim caliphates, a medieval construct form of fiefdom that is a platform for further territorial conquest. Groups like Daesh, also known as ISIL, claim territory, engage in extortion and people smuggling, yet impose taxes and purport to provide services. This business model is being emulated by other groups, a franchise of terrorism that can be established in unstable, volatile locations. Transnational crime, the drug cartels, corruption and cybercrime are also challenging the role of states. I'll leave for another day the impact of pandemic disease, environmental degradation and financial instability. The challenges we face are borderless, yet the world is still divided into and defined by, and to an extent constrained by, jurisdictions. I believe the nation-state, despite the challenges we faced, will persist, overcome, and indeed thrive as the organising unit through which nations realise their values and advance the rules-based international community. I'll focus on some of the main challenges we face, common collective challenges, whether born of globalisation, accident, or ill intent, and discuss how we can respond, working together as nations and individually, each taking our share of the burden. Through our United States alliance and separately with like-minded partners, Britain and France, Indonesia and South Korea, Canada and Belgium and others the world over, we must be prepared to lead and to adapt. The Westphalian system will turn 367 years old this year. It is striking to think that despite the transformation of the world, scientifically, technologically, socially and industrially in that time, and the changes that have taken place within the governance of nations, this system has persisted. It has been modified with international law, norms, and organisations continuing to be developed and advancing. Yet many of the basic elements of the system are unchanged. The United States and Australia cherish certain values. Our systems enshrine citizenship and democracy. We believe fiercely in certain things: the rule of law, equality before that law, property rights, individual freedom, democracy. It is the vehicle of a nation-state through which we give expression to these values and organise to defend them where necessary. At the international level, it is the system of nation-states that has, on balance, been the foundation of humanity's efforts to build peaceful, safe and prosperous societies. With all its flaws, and some nation states embrace systems, values and strategies that many of us find shockingly flawed, it remains the case that it is an international system based on nation states that has allowed us to improve greatly the circumstances of much of humanity in recent centuries. Yet today there are serious challenges to the sovereignty of the nation state. Many of these challenges are due simply to change, whether technological, social, economic or political. Corporations, for example, have long been indispensable engines of our global economy and now, in many cases, rival countries in terms of their economic power. Consider this. If you rank the top 100 countries and companies by GDP and revenue, only 66 of those largest global economic entities are nation states. Apple, General Motors, Wells Fargo, Boeing, Procter & Gamble, Microsoft, they're all up there in the top 100 in terms of revenue. In legitimately striving to improve returns to their shareholders, global companies, big and small, structure their affairs and businesses to minimise paying tax while operating within the law. Tax collectors face tremendous difficulty capturing taxes on revenue from their domestic jurisdictions. While such corporate behaviour is understandable, developing countries are estimated to lose between US $35 and US $160 billion in revenue each year because of corporate profit shifting. Now, if all companies paid taxes on profits in the countries in which they are derived, this would largely negate the need for global aid flows or development assistance. Global official development assistance in 2013, for example, was about US $135 billion, less than the upper estimate of lost tax revenue. Now, international aid is one of my responsibilities as Australia's Foreign Minister, so I can't ignore these facts. But governments and business must work together to achieve more equitable outcomes for developing countries. Continuingly rapid technological and economic change, whether in the form of the social media revolution or the transition from regional and national to global value chains, will require us to continue to adapt and innovate. Now for the challenges to the sovereignty of the nation state that do come from malevolent actors. Tragically, the past year alone has been filled with violent examples. Terrorism is now more global, more dangerous, more diversified than ever before. Terrorist groups have emerged or grown in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen. Daesh, or ISIL, has declared a caliphate, putting whole villages, towns, cities and vital infrastructure in Syria and Iraq under its ruthless governance. The Haqqani Network, a group of Islamist insurgents opposing coalition forces in Afghanistan and Pakistan and allied with the Taliban, continues its criminal operations regardless of borders or governments. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has claimed responsibility for the tragic Charlie Hebdo attacks and continues to plot terrorist attacks around the globe. Boko Haram has also declared a caliphate and taken control of large parts of Nigeria, and on a day-to-day basis is seeking to impose its brutal governance over the people living there. Offshoot terrorist cells and individuals, the lone wolf, have staged barbaric attacks, including in Canada, France, Belgium, the United States, Britain and Australia. And we confront the phenomenon of foreign fighters and terrorist-trained returnees. The manifestation of this problem is global. Despite our efforts, terrorism persists as a continuing challenge to the sovereignty of established states. Its perpetrators have no respect for Australia or France, the United States, or Iraq, Russia, China, or any other state. They have no respect for borders, laws, or norms of behaviour. They believe that brutality and violence is an appropriate and acceptable means to achieve their ends. Henry Kissinger recently wrote in World Order that zones of non-governance or jihad now stretch across the Muslim world. When one also takes into account the agonies of Central Africa, where a generations-long Congolese civil war has drawn in all neighbouring states, and conflicts in the Central African Republic and South Sudan threaten to metastasise similarly, a significant portion of the world's territory and population is on the verge of effectively falling out of the international state system altogether. Then there are those whose motives are financially rapacious rather than political, as is the case of the international crime syndicates and drug cartels. The effect is still insidious in its undermining of the institutions of state. Crime networks challenge the state by driving corruption, undermining rule of law, and damaging vast numbers of lives. These twin perils, terrorism and organised criminal networks, thrive in places where sovereignty and national institutions are weak. This is why Australia and the United States and others try to build or rebuild stability and state effectiveness in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. We're fighting in the Middle East today for this very reason, to end the opportunities that lawlessness and weak sovereignty provide for terrorist and criminal networks to grow. Narco-terrorism, the financing of terrorism by profits from illegal drug trafficking, is expanding exponentially. Even as nations like the United States and Australia have stepped up the fight against illicit drugs, criminals have used the internet to open new distribution channels and circumvent state controls, and these take time to close down. In July last year, the BBC reported that illegal drug listings online had more than doubled in a 12-month period, despite efforts to close down operations like Silk Road. These networks are interconnected and they make big money. Forbes magazine has estimated that Daesh, ISIL, has an annual income of $2 billion. Hamas has annual revenue around half that, about $1 billion. Hezbollah, $500 million annually. International drug cartels collectively make billions of dollars annually. These businesses, and they run like businesses, thrive where sovereignty is weak. The money they make flows around the world, corrupting and undermining states as it's reinvested in further illegal activities. Now, last year, for example, it was reported that Mexico's Knights Templar cartel had diversified well beyond drug trafficking, deriving major income streams from illegal logging, mining, and extortion. Australia is part of a multinational campaign to stop drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. In April last year, HMAS Darwin, a Royal Australian Navy guided missile frigate, seized 1,032 kilograms of heroin off the coast of Somalia. This is one of the largest amounts of heroin ever seized on the high seas. Then there is the realm of cyber. We've long been anticipating the disruptive potential of cybercrime and cyber theft. But recently, for the first time, we've seen a rogue nation-state launch a major attack of unprecedented destructiveness against a major private corporation. Presumably, North Korea wanted to coerce its target. Ultimately, it failed. The film, The Interview, was shown and garnered unexpected box office success, but only after significant damage was inflicted on Sony Corporation. The United States' response was swift and crucial in demonstrating that such cyber attacks against any public or private institution cannot be tolerated. Such cyber attacks do not differ greatly from those of terrorism, and like terrorism, they pose a significant challenge to state sovereignty and to our ability to protect the freedoms we should all enjoy. Australia, the United States and others have experienced firsthand the immense damage that can be wrought by cyber thieves operating as hacktivists. Governments face an ongoing battle to secure their networks, the very systems on which we rely to protect the interests of our citizens. I set out these challenges not because they are overwhelming. They are not. I list them to make the case for action. The United States has led collective responses to global problems again and again, especially since the end of the Cold War. It has received its share of credit, but it has also been allocated more than its share of the blame when things have not worked out. This reflects the unique and indispensable role of the United States as the world's superpower, with the largest economy and the greatest political and military might. But the United States should not have to bear alone the burden of solving every challenge that we as nation-states face. Australia does not match the United States in sheer heft. What we seek to do is make a serious contribution, at the very minimum, a responsible and proportional contribution to protect the rules-based international system. We are there with our ally and with other partners. I believe that with the benefit of the alliance comes a responsibility to share the burdens, both in material terms and in providing creative and proactive policy input. Australia must face these challenges just as much as the United States. We have just concluded a 2-year term on the United Nations Security Council. Australia came to the role in January 2013, and we were determined that elected members could and should make a difference in strengthening the Council's role in the maintenance of international peace and security. Of course, we endeavoured to use our term to support Australia's core national security interests and those of the global order. We aim to make a practical, constructive contribution across the entirety of the Council's agenda. In doing so, we achieved some important outcomes. In July of 2014, we led the Council's response to the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines MH17 over eastern Ukraine, a criminal act that caused the loss of 298 lives from many nations, including 38 Australian souls. Our resolution, adopted unanimously as UN Security Council Resolution 2166, backed both a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and a full, impartial international investigation requiring all states to cooperate fully with the recovery and investigative efforts. The remains of all our people have been recovered. We're bringing them home, but our quest for accountability and justice continues. We were active on counter-terrorism, securing Council agreement in November to strengthen international cooperation on combating terrorism, including tackling the threat of foreign fighters and countering violent extremism. We co-sponsored a resolution condemning all acts of terrorism committed by Daesh and the al-Nusra Front. As chair of 3 Security Council sanctions committees, we strengthened the Council's response to the threats posed by al-Qaeda, Iran's nuclear program, and the Taliban, and targeting emerging threats including Boko Haram and ISIL. We led Council debate on sanctions reform, boosting engagement from affected countries, enhancing the system's transparency, and mobilising more professional support and coordination from the United Nations itself. We took a leading role in the Council's response to the humanitarian crisis in Syria, securing the adoption of 3 groundbreaking resolutions within 12 months, requiring the Syrian government and other parties to the conflict to allow humanitarian access to millions in desperate need. We coordinated the Council's work on Afghanistan during the crucial period leading into the transition at the end of 2014 from the NATO-led combat mission to Afghan security control. This culminated in Security Council support for what is called Operation Resolute Support, which will help train and advise Afghan security forces and in which Australia is participating. And we played a leading role in determining the Security Council's response to the findings of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights in North Korea, headed by former Australian High Court Judge Michael Kirby. A groundbreaking, harrowing report which no civilised member of the international community can ignore. With the cooperation of like-minded Council members, the humanitarian situation in North Korea has now, for the first time, been added to the Council's recurring agenda for continued monitoring. Our contribution to global security did not begin with our term on the Security Council, nor does it end there. For example, Australia was one of 7 co-authors of the Arms Trade Treaty, the first legally binding instrument negotiated in the United Nations to establish common standards for the international transfer of conventional weapons. The treaty will help promote security, stability and economic development, including in our Indo-Pacific, our backyard, by preventing the diversion of weapons to terrorists and other criminal groups. Since the treaty opened for signature in June 2013, 130 states have signed it, 60 have ratified it. It entered into force on the 24th of December 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, the ANZUS alliance clearly sets out our core mutual defence obligations. However, our broad and deep relationship as like-minded nation-states leads us naturally to work together to meet head-on these wider threats to peace and prosperity in the context of our rules-based international system.